Good morning, everyone. The other day, my neighbor dropped off some corn and watermelon for us, which was super sweet. I only met him about 2 months ago, and it was a really nice gesture to welcome us to the neighborhood. So I thought to repay him, I would bake him some of my favorite cookies, which are Amaretti, and they go really, really well with coffee. So if that's what you want to do for breakfast, highly endorse it. And while I'm baking those up, I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about sustainable fashion terms, because I know there's still a lot of confusion out there about, what's the difference between sustainable and eco and slow and ethical. So I just wanted to help clear some of that up for all of you. And surprisingly, baking and sustainable fashion have quite a bit in common. So I'm going to cover that with you guys as going through the recipe. So I got this recipe originally from Olivia's Cuisine, and it's become one of my favorites. It's really, really easy to make. It's only, I think, 6 ingredients, and it's naturally gluten-free. So if you're like me and don't eat wheat or gluten, then this is the recipe for you, and it's really, really easy to make. So you want to start with 2 egg whites. Now you're probably wondering, when I said eco-fashion and baking have a lot in common, what the heck I was talking about. So I'm never going to be a master pastry chef. It's just never going to happen. But I need to know what goes with what. So let's take bread, for example. You might want to know that brioche makes really, really good French toast, or that ciabatta is great with charcuterie. So you want to know your different breads, let's say. And maybe you don't want to learn how to make them, but you certainly want to know what to order when you go out, or you want to know what to buy if you're having guests over or just cooking for yourself. And the same goes for fashion and fashion terminology in of itself. You need to know what to look for so that when you are out shopping, whether it be for yourself or for a gift, or you just want to learn a little bit more, you have a foundation to build upon. So that's kind of the similarity between the two. There are more, and I'm thinking in future videos, because I bake all the time, I'll give you guys some more of those. So after you have your 2 egg whites, you want to add in, the recipe calls for a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Just going to use my best judgment here. And then you want to mix that together with a hand mixer on high until you get really stiff peaks. So before I move on to the next step of the recipe, let's start with the biggest term out there, which is sustainable fashion, sustainability. And in order to talk about what sustainable fashion is, we need to look at the original term, where it came from. So it originated in the UN from the Brundtland Commission, and it essentially says sustainable development is the meeting the needs of the present without compromising the potential needs of future generations. So when it comes to fashion, and we're only going to be talking about fashion terms, because just like I'm not going to bake every cookie under the sun, I'm not going to tackle sustainability in its entirety. So from a fashion perspective, that takes into account the environment, workers, and also the businesses themselves. So looking at the environment, what are we using in terms of processing? Are we using, how much water are we using? What comes out of the production in terms of chemicals and dyes, runoff, and also sustainable growing. And on the flip side of that is also, is also looking at the materials used. So, are we using synthetics, which could potentially not break down in landfills for a long time and certainly affect generations in the future. And then, like I said, workers as well. So looking at living wages, safe working conditions, fair trade. You've probably heard that term thrown around quite a bit. Making sure that it's not continuing the cycle of poverty, that families have an opportunity to, not put their children in that same situation. And then it also takes into account the business strategy themselves. So how are businesses approaching fashion, not just in the production of the clothing, but also their corporate practices? So looking at shipping, looking at, how are they powering their processing centers and their manufacturing centers? Are they using solar power? Are they using wind energy? So that's kind of sustainable fashion in a nutshell. It essentially is looking at what we're doing today and whether or not it's going to hurt generations down the line, and looking at the entirety of the process. Okay, so first term down, first step of the cookies finished. So the next thing we do with the cookies is you want to take a cup of sugar. It does call for baker's sugar, which is a really, really fine granulated sugar. I don't have that. You can make it by putting it in a food processor, but to be honest, I'm a little bit too lazy to do that, so I'm just going to use granulated sugar. I've used it in the past when I've made this and had no problems. And then you want to use almond flour, and 2 cups of that. Just mix the two together. So the original recipe does call for 2 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. I decided to omit that, and I've never had a problem with this recipe not using the all-purpose flour. I would love to hear, though, if you guys try this recipe and use all-purpose flour. You can certainly use gluten-free all-purpose flour. Hear what you guys think of it if you add that in, and also, if you don't add it in, what are your kind of thoughts on this? Like I said, it goes really, really well with coffee, and it has almost a meringue consistency when it's done. So it's a little bit chewy. You can bake them longer to get a harder kind of crunch to them. I don't prefer that. All right, so all you're gonna do is mix those 2 together, and then you're just going to take your egg whites and salt that you've mixed up, whipped together, and combine the 2. I did just forget a step. I was thinking about the next term and I forgot a step. You want to take a half a teaspoon of almond extract, and I really like the Flavor Organics. It's naturally gluten-free, which is great. Just gonna put that in. And all you want to do is whisk that into the egg whites. I'm just going to do it right here on top before I combine the 2 together. Okay, and then this is the fun part. Get to use your hands. The next term, and the one that is used most interchangeably with sustainable, is eco. And it's the one I use. It's just preference, to be honest. They've kind of become synonymous. But if you are looking online and want to do some further research, you probably want to look up sustainable fashion, as it has more search results. But eco fashion will point you in the right direction as well. So eco fashion is everything that sustainable fashion is, as is that we've covered, but it also looks more at the immediate impact and needs of the fashion industry, and in particular the consumer. So looking at the impact to the consumer, whether it be the dyes that are used, bleaches, anti-wrinkle, things like that nature, and how that could potentially affect our health and our well-being from leaching into our skin and also leaching into the waterways. It takes into account environmental factors as well. But it also, when it says the health of the consumer, for me that also means financial health. So fast fashion has created mini seasons, and there are about 52 mini seasons a year, which is shocking. It's one every week on the extreme end. And what that means is a lot of times the clothing is poor quality, so you're going back, you're buying more. We're certainly not immune to marketing, so we want the newest trend. But what that does is it empties our wallets. And I would argue that in terms of health to the consumer, financial health is incredibly important. And on that front, fast fashion is not your friend, and eco fashion kind of addresses that. It also addresses workers' rights, like I mentioned with sustainable. You know, you're looking at fair wages, you're looking at safe working conditions, and then the environment as well. Looking at, you know, how much product we're creating, you know, renting versus thrifting versus upcycling, use of chemicals, the processing itself, tanning for leathers. So eco, like I said, eco and sustainable fashion are pretty much interchangeable terms. It really comes down to preference, although sustainable fashion focuses a little bit more on the overall process, and eco fashion, it covers all three, but looks a little bit more at the here and now. When I said these cookies were easy, I wasn't joking. There's only 2 steps left. And before I get to that, the recipe does say to let this rest for 15 minutes. Again, I don't let it rest. You can. Some of them call to refrigerate for up to an hour. I haven't really found a difference, so if you find one, let me know. But for now, let me grab something to scoop these up with. I'm just going to use a tablespoon measurement to scoop these with, and all you're going to want to do, let me pull this up here so you can see it, just have a baking pan with some parchment paper on it, and then you also want to have, I use a bowl with some confectioner's sugar. The recipe doesn't say how much to use. You can use your judgment. If I say less is better to start, you can add more if you need it. You're just going to scoop a tablespoon, roll it, and then roll it in the confectioner's sugar until it's nice and covered. And then when you put it on the baking sheet, I'll put it down here so you can see it, you just want to smush it down just a little bit, not too much. They will spread, but not like your typical cookie will. So while I'm rolling these, let's tackle the next term, which is slow fashion. So like I mentioned, fast fashion has created all these micro seasons, and slow fashion is essentially the antithesis of that. It's looking at how to slow down our fashion consumption, our buying consumption. So this is where you'll find, if you ever see the term capsule collection or minimalism, this generally falls under slow fashion. And it also takes into account things such as thrifting, but generally looks at our overall consumption habits and how much do we need. So if you're interested in capsule collections, that's where you want to look. And then green fashion is the next one. And green fashion, while I don't know for certain, the term I believe has been around longer than, you know, eco fashion, slow fashion, and essentially green fashion takes a look at the environment. It takes approximately 2,700 liters of water, not to produce a cotton shirt, but to just grow the cotton and to process the cotton to create that shirt. And it's about, I think that's about 400 gallons, don't quote me on that, math was never my strong suit, and conversion either. So it's a lot of water that's being used in the process, but green fashion goes beyond, you know, resources such as the materials being used. Is it sustainable? You know, bamboo is kind of the hot textile at the moment. Is bamboo really sustainable to use, or is it just replacing one natural fiber with another without any long-term study on the impacts, environmental impacts? So aside from looking at the textiles use, again, it goes back to environmental impact of processing, such as, you know, the chemicals used in leather tanning, but also the synthetics as well. So a lot of our clothing, has spandex in it, it has PVC in it, and looking at whether or not those synthetics are sustainable means of production. So what's their, at what rate will they break down once the clothing is disposed of? What's the impact of manufacturing in terms of water runoff, air pollution, things of that nature. So if you're more environmentally inclined, green fashion is where you want to be looking. And it's certainly an important aspect of sustainable fashion. And last but not least is ethical fashion. Now, I think a lot of people equate ethical fashion with animal welfare, and while that's not wrong, that's not how the term originated. So ethical fashion addresses primarily the rights of the workers. And going back to the umbrella term sustainable, it looks at fair wages, safe working conditions, and making sure that it doesn't continue the cycle of poverty regardless of where the production is happening, whether it be here in the US or in Bangladesh. A lot of people tuned into eco-fashion, or ethical fashion I should say, with the collapse of Rana Plaza, and the documentary The True Cost did wonders to help raise awareness to what's happening in the fashion industry. But there's still a lot of changes that need to be made in terms of labor rights, not just overseas, believe it or not, here in the US as well, and making sure that the people who are producing our clothing, whether they be growing it or, you know, cutting the fabric, sewing it together, shipping it, making sure that they are, excuse me guys, properly cared for and have opportunity for advancement, to learn some skills, to create a sustainable income for themselves and support their families. So if you're geared more towards human rights, ethical fashion is the way to go. And like I said, a lot of people have now equated this with animal welfare, and that's also kind of the term you'd want to look for when looking, you know, at faux fur versus real fur. You can also look at vegan fashion, which is just that. It's vegan fashion, no animal products, but it all falls under that umbrella of ethical fashion. Cookies are rolled, dipped, flattened a little bit. I'm gonna put them in the oven, 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Recipe originally calls for 25 to 30 minutes. I tend to keep mine 20 to 25 minutes because I like mine a little bit more chewy. And on that note too, they will keep for up to 3 days in an airtight container if you refrigerate them. You can choose not to refrigerate them. They will get a little bit harder. So like I said, if you like harder cookies, just either bake them longer, or you can leave them sitting out for a little bit and the air will naturally have that happen. Done, and the only step left before you devour them all is just to transfer them onto a cooling sheet, let them cool down, and then you just want to store them in an airtight container in the fridge, or if you're like me, just eat them all throughout the day. And because I am all about fashion, I thought I would share with you guys a little bit of what I'm wearing. So the sweater I have on came from my mother-in-law. It was hers. And we were over their house visiting about 2 years ago, and it was a little bit chilly, so I borrowed the sweater. I've had it ever since. She does now. And because it's natural fibers, a lot of natural fibers are self-cleaning, so I think I have only washed it maybe 2 or 3 times in the 2 years that I've had it. It doesn't smell, it's not dirty, it does need to be delinted every once in a while, but that's it. And then the belt I have is from my mother. She got it when she was in, I think she said her mid-20s, something like that, and she gave it to me this summer, and I've been wearing it non-stop. You guys have probably seen them in my Instagram photos. I love any belt that's a little bit decorative, has a pattern to it, because you can mix and match it a million different ways. Dress it up, dress it down, so huge fan of that. And then the skirt that I have on is from one of my new favorite eco companies called Sololu, and the founder Roseanne is absolutely lovely. She produces clothing. It's all handmade in Bali from eco textiles. And what I love that she does the most is she has an eye on designs that are meant to, you know, to be worn throughout the entire year. So they're not seasonal. And this is the, hopefully you guys can see it, this is the Sedona midi pencil skirt, and it does have a slit up here. The color is fantastic because it's incredibly versatile. You can wear it with anything else, any other color. And the fabric has a little bit of give to it, which is great. It's really, really comfortable to wear throughout the day. And if you're like me and eat a lot of cookies, this is the skirt for you. And it's also fantastic because you can dress it up if you're going out at night, or you can dress it down if you're in office or just around the house. So that's it for the cookies and the sustainable fashion terms. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions about any of the terms we went over, want to know a little bit more, or have any other questions about eco-fashion in general, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below and I will address them in future videos. Thank you guys.
Babe,
What do you want?
cookies are done. Do you want to test them?
Yeah.
Twist your arm.
All right, pick out a good one for me to try.
That one. It's got good crinkle action on the top. I mean, I know you've had these before. It's a different batch though. And
They're excellent. Soft, chewy, perfect texture.
future food critic.
We'll see about that.